Hi, everyone. Welcome to our second webinar in our webinar series, our summer webinar series. This webinar is actually going to be of just me. I am really excited for you all to be here. I have some slides. I'm going to share them right now. We're also live on TikTok. So TikTok folks, I hope you're joining us here. And I am going to share my slides right now. Okay, so today we're talking about reading strategies for autistic children, and I'm going to give a little bit of a rundown of what reading actually is, and then talk about the way that we teach reading to neurodivergent children and some strategies to help parents along that path. We're going to talk about reading. We're going to talk about some of the challenges when teaching neurodivergent children to read. And then I'm going to talk about some of the more popular approaches to reading instruction, some of the more popular curriculums, and then kind of give a brief overview of a few of the ones that I like and am familiar with. And we'll leave time for questions at the end. Just a few housekeeping notes. Next week, join us. We have another webinar about shopping for therapy with Gabe, the Indomitable Black Man, on TikTok. Gabe is wonderful, and we're so happy to have him doing a webinar for us. And also, our first parenting course is now available for pre-registration on our website. So we hope that you all sign up. It's going to be a great course. It's going to have a kind of like meeting in person component along with a lot of different resources that you're going to get weekly, and we're going to cover the kind of like major topics. So we hope to see you all there. Okay. So talking about reading, there's really, when we think about reading, we often think of just the kind of act of making the symbols on the page turn into sounds. And I'll often talk to parents who will say, oh, my child is, a fluent reader, they're hyperlexic, and that they have like all of these great reading skills, which they do. But oftentimes parents are talking about kind of one aspect of reading, when actually reading is the act of making sense out of what you read. So it's not only decoding, but there's other components that go into it as well. The first, I'm actually going to start on the bottom left, is decoding. So decoding is what most people think of as reading, and that's your ability to break down words into sounds in order to read them. And oftentimes, that is one of the areas that actually, kind of clicks first for a lot of autistic kids, is the decoding piece of it. And I've actually taught many hyperlexic kids that love to decode, and will decode and decode and decode, but struggle with maybe some of the other parts of it. Decoding is a kind of combination of phonemic awareness, the awareness of the sounds that letters make, and then phonics, the ability to kind of decode that in the written form. So we know that the CH says ch, for example. So that is an example of decoding. And many of us are taught decoding through phonics. And so we learn that as young children, and then we generalize it very quickly. So as we become more fluent readers, we are sounding out less and less, and we're reading more in chunks or in whole words. Beginner readers are often decoding little pieces by little pieces. Then after that, you have your fluency. So decoding is where we start. And then we move into fluency. So fluency is not just your ability to break apart words, but it's also your speed, your accuracy, and your expression when you read. So this is where we're kind of moving from just what the symbols tell us to do when we see them. So we know that this vowel says this, we know that these two letters say this, and we're starting to move towards making meaning out of those letters. So it's the speed with which you read, how accurately you read, and then also your expression. So are you stopping at punctuation? Are you reading in phrases that make sense? Are you providing inflection when you see a question mark, for example. And this is where we start to see, a lot of struggles among autistic kids, because we're moving from that kind of more rote decoding to making meaning, really. Fluent readers, as we become more fluent readers, we read in words and in phrases, and it will sound natural and smooth as we're reading. Then on top of that, we have comprehension. And comprehension is an area, we're going to cover it a little bit later, that is a bigger struggle for a lot of neurodivergent kids who maybe don't struggle as much with the decoding and maybe more struggle with making meaning out of the text that they're reading. It is how you make sense and meaning out of what you read, and then part and parcel of that is vocabulary. So vocabulary is a fundamental piece in comprehension. So if you don't understand the words that you're reading, it's going to be hard to make meaning out of what you're reading, because, the vocabulary that's included is going to be a fundamental piece of that. Vocabulary is the words that you understand and that you use with meaning. So it's not just the words that you know or that you can define, but it's the words that you are able to combine with other words to communicate, to create meaning. So I'm going to go through kind of each one of these sections and talk a little bit about what are some of the different approaches to them, and then give some practical suggestions for working on each one of these things with your child. And some of these are more developmental, right? So we're going to be increasing vocabulary as children get older. But if your child is in the kind of preschool, kindergarten, first grade, second grade, and on, decoding is probably, the focus of their reading instruction at school. And there are different ways to learn decoding. So many of us, if you're around my age, you were probably taught using an approach that's called whole language, which has kind of been phased out, which was kind of using environmental print to learn how to read, which is why a lot of us are actually quite bad at phonics. So these are some of the more research-based approaches to learning decoding, or kind of like how to read the words on the page, how to just see what you see on the page and then turn that into a word, a phrase, sounds, etc. The first is what's called Orton-Gillingham or Wilson. It's really like an umbrella term. It's your classic phonics. So there's various like brandings of it. So one is called Orton-Gillingham or OG. Another one is Wilson. You may also hear Foundations, which is the kind of mainstream curriculum of Wilson. There's also something called Project Read. All of these are Orton-Gillingham based, which is a kind of incremental approach to phonics. It's research-based, and it teaches these phonics skills in a particular order. Most of it is, applying word attack skills, which is like, I know that these three letters make this sound. I know that this vowel makes this sound. I know that this, syllable pattern gets broken up like this. It gives a really systematic way to break apart words. And it is by far the most research-based approach to reading instruction. So that is the kind of tier one in most schools, is your Orton-Gillingham, Wilson, Project Read. It goes by a lot of different names, but it's your classic kind of phonics approach. The next approach would be EdMark, which is, EdMark is a really kind of, old school curriculum. I think any special education teachers who are listening probably, got their first classroom and found like a dusty EdMark kit in the closet. EdMark has been around for a really long time, and it was developed specifically for use with students with intellectual disabilities. What's different about Edmark than Orton Gillingham or Wilson is that it actually uses sight words. So it has kids memorize pretty much all of the words. So it really doesn't actually teach phonics, but it teaches primarily sight word recognition. So it will, teach kids of, specific vocabulary in a repetitive sense where they will get kind of core basic vocabulary. And this is usually used when Orton Gillingham or kind of phonics approaches don't work. Edmark is kind of that second tier. Edmark can be great. For some kids, it works amazingly. The problems with Edmark is that if your child is approaching a word that's novel, right? So a word that hasn't been taught to them through the Edmark system, they're not going to have the tools to break it apart because it's not teaching phonics, right? So it's teaching, these specific words. But if they see a word that is, follows the same pattern but is different, they may not know that word. And then this last one is my personal favorite. It kind of was very popular for a while and fell out of fashion, but you can still buy the kits. It's called SMILE, Structured Methods in Language Education. It was developed by a speech therapist, and it combines Edmark and Orton Gillingham. So it's a phonics program, but it's specifically designed for students with moderate to severe intellectual disabilities. It can be used with students who are non-speaking, and it uses phonics, but instead of Orton Gillingham or Wilson, where you have to remember a lot of rules, it kind of takes that part out of it by using kind of visual repetition. It's a great program. I've actually used that program quite a bit, and I've taught many kids who were previously not readers to read using the SMILE program. Okay, so here's some tips for decoding. The first is that when you're teaching decoding to kids who have either intellectual disabilities or are struggling, you want to focus on the sounds of the letters only. So one of the first things we teach kids is the names of all the letters. So we say, that's an A, that's a B, when actually the names of the letters really don't teach us how to read at all. We actually don't need to know the names of the letters. It's a nice to know, but it's not a need to know. So if you are, working with your child and you kind of have a limited amount of things that they will remember or kind of focus on, then it's much better to focus on the sounds the letters make as opposed to the names of the letters. So focusing, when you see a letter A or you see an apple, instead of saying A, apple, you can say apple, right? And you're going to want to make sure that you're clipping your sounds. So clipping your sounds means instead of saying the B says B, which is kind of what we all say, you want to make sure you're really clipping it, which means you're not adding a UH at the end. So you want to just say B like that. It gets confusing when you start teaching kids to blend letters together and you're adding that on the end. So if you're trying to teach cat, right, and you're going to have them tap out cat, you're going to say k-at, right? That when they start blending it, they go k-at, and it starts sounding like cat. But if you're adding that UH, it starts sounding like ka-atta, and that is not the word cat. So it's really imperative that when you're teaching sounds that you're clipping your sounds and not adding that kind of UH at the end of it. My husband will tell you that whenever I hear teachers, I've watched my first grader on Zoom now for a year. Whenever I hear teachers adding that UH, like he's annoyed now, because I'm like, no, you have to clip this out. So it's really, really, really important. The second tip is to stop singing the ABCs. I know it sounds like a really good idea to use music to teach the alphabet, but for kids who are echolalic or who are, really interested in the sound of the song, they start thinking elemental P is one letter on top of other things. So you want to make sure that, you're actually teaching the sounds in the natural environment, and you're, kind of using them in context, because singing them in the song, one, it's all letter names. Two, it's in this very specific order that they're not going to see those letters in. And sometimes it's hard to generalize that each one of these things I'm saying are separate units of sound when I'm teaching them, where they kind of sound like they all go together, right? The next tip that I have is to collaborate with your SLP. So if your child is non-speaking, or they're minimally verbal, or they are just learning certain sounds, you may want to start teaching the sounds that they can already produce first. So normally we teach letters in alphabetical order. And this is one of the things that Smile does that I really like, is it teaches the sounds in order of typical speech development. So it starts with sounds that are more commonly produced earlier than others, and it pushes some of those harder sounds to the end. So if you're collaborating with your speech therapist, you may want to say, what are the 10 sounds that I know that they can produce? And I'll teach those letters first and start building words just with those letters. That way your child is able to participate in kind of, producing them orally if they can. And then the last tip is that if your child is non-speaking, it does not mean that you cannot teach them to read. So you can teach receptively. And what receptively means is that your child is receiving the information, and doesn't mean that they have to say it out loud. So you can show them 2 letters and say, which one is B, right? Or, let's find B, and they'll find the one that, you're holding 2 out for them. Or like you're playing toys and just not, in the kind of as you're playing, which one of these says t, right? And then you can find which Thomas train, is it Thomas or Percy that starts with t, right? So you're going to be able to kind of teach those letters as you're playing in a natural way. And it doesn't necessarily require verbal speech. I don't know how many IEP meetings I've sat in saying that we can't teach this child to read because they're non-speaking, and that is just not the case. I've taught many non-speaking kids how to read. The next area of reading I want to talk about is fluency. So fluency is something that you can't necessarily teach directly. Fluency is learned through modeling and through hearing language. And what do we do when we're talking to kids who have language impairments? Is we simplify our language to the point that it is almost not the way anyone would ever speak. And so we actually do quite a disservice to our kids because they don't get to hear fluent language. And so as you're reading, as you're talking, we use this kind of weird sing-song therapy voice, right? You all know that put in like that very weird cadence that we use when teaching neurodivergent kids. Actually not fluent. That's not how fluent readers sound when they are reading. So it's really important that even if your child has, significant language delays, it's still important that when you are reading to your child, you still read fluently, because it's giving that exposure to what fluent reading sounds like. And even if they can't say it out loud, they may still hear that back in their heads as they're reading, right? So it's important to keep doing that, even if it sounds like your child is maybe not understanding. You're still building that foundation of this is what fluent language sounds like. You can use your kind of car time or waiting time. One of my favorite tools for this is Story Podcast. There's one that's called Stories Podcast, and there's a whole bunch of other ones. You can just Google them, or, Books on Tape is like kind of like the old school version. But hearing other people tell stories or use fluent reading language is really important for building that sense of, oh, this is what fluent reading sounds like. If your child is experimenting with fluent reading, you can use recording, so like dragon dictation or like voice notes, hearing them, having them read into it and then play it back for themselves. And then reading the same text over and over and over again. They're going to get more fluent as they read it. And maybe you have them read a line and you read the next line, and they read a line and you read the next line, or you read the line, they read it after you. Just practicing making sense out of what you're reading. You know, what does punctuation mean? What does a period mean? What does our voice do when we see a question mark? Those are all things that contribute to fluent reading. And the last tip for fluency really is to use books that are repetitive and rhythmic. And this is like a whole genre of children's literature. One of my favorite books is Peanut Butter and Cupcake. It has like a kind of sing-song repetitive, you know, it's the peanut butter sandwich is like new in the school and is like looking for a friend, and it keeps going to all these different, you know, characters, like asking basically, will you be my friend? And then there's like a little rhyme that they say, and then they move on to the next one. And at the end, the peanut butter finds the jelly. So that's a great book. There's a whole bunch of other ones. The Elephant and Piggy books are kind of like that. Anything that has like a repetitive line that's repeated throughout, because that gives your child an opportunity to participate multiple times, and they don't actually have to be able to read to participate. So they can just memorize that one little piece of it. And then, you know, usually it builds it up where it's like, right? Like, and then they know the last part because it repeats over and over again. So the next piece is comprehension. So comprehension is tricky because we see a lot of IEP goals that say, will answer WH questions. My least favorite IEP goal. WH questions can be anything. It's not a specific, we think it sounds specific, but it's not specific. Anything can be a WH question. Who is the character is a WH question. And what were the major contributing factors to World War II? Those are both WH questions that are very different. And so having that as an IEP goal actually doesn't give us enough information. We actually need to be able to break apart text into their core components, and we need to be able to teach kids what those components are. And we need to know them for ourselves. And so in order for comprehension to improve, you actually need to use a system that can be used with fidelity. And that means that there's various curriculums that are meant to improve comprehension that have like a measurable component to it, where you do this and then you take a little, you know, you practice doing it, and then there's data and you can see that there's improvement or not, right? And so that improvement is important, but there not being improvement is also an important metric, because if there's no improvement, then we need to switch to something else. Starting with simple narratives at first, and parents, it's important for you to know what makes a story simple. So a kind of your classic narrative, right, is your, you know, we teach this to kids all the time, is that somebody wanted but so then story, right? Like somebody wanted something, but there was something blocking it. So they tried this, then this happened. And then at the end, everything, you know, came all together, right? So it's really that there's one obstacle, they try a couple times to get over it, and by the end they get over it. And that's a very simple story. Most fairy tales kind of follow that same story. And that's the kind of stories you want to start with. As you get more complex, right, you may have more than one character that has their own somebody wanted but so then, or they may end up in a different way, or there may be, you know, kind of sub characters and subplots. Those are as stories get more complex. But your basic first stories that you should be doing with your child are these kind of somebody wanted but so then stories. And so if you're going to be doing beginning comprehension work, you need to make sure that the books you're choosing actually do follow that simple narrative. Because at the very beginning, you're going to be teaching the character, then you're going to teach the setting, the problem, you know, what they tried to solve it, and then the solution. Another important thing is that a lot of autistic kids don't like fiction. And so at the elementary level, we're really, interested in fiction because that's typically how we're measuring progress on fiction texts. But it's important to also give kids an opportunity to develop their nonfiction reading skills as well. And nonfiction, as you get older, you read more and more nonfiction. At the younger grades, you're reading 80-90% of your day is fiction. But when you get to, later in high school and then in college, you're reading primarily nonfiction. So having that skill set, as much as it's not super important to many elementary school teachers, it's okay. And it can be an area for autistic kids to thrive and to shine, because that, oftentimes, we typically do one of two reading assessments. We either do the DRA or the Fountas and Pinnell. So you either get a reading level that is a number or a letter. The DRA is done in numbers, Fountas Pinnell in letters. They're more or less, very similar assessments. But typically they're tested on fiction. But you'll often find that if you give kids the nonfiction texts, which actually are in the kits, they will score much higher, autistic kids. So if your child is not progressed in reading levels, you should ask their teacher to try the nonfiction as well and see, if there's any difference. So there are comprehension programs that are designed to help autistic kids, or kids in general, improve their comprehension. These are just some of the ones that I know of. There are others. There's a lot more on the computer now, but these are the kind of, classics. So first is Lindemood Bell. There's a program they have called Visualizing and Verbalizing that really helps develop that kind of, ability to visualize a story, to think about what the characters want, and it helps to improve vocabulary. It's a really great program. Oftentimes speech therapists are trained in Lindemood Bell, but there are some classroom teachers that are also trained in it. The next is story grammar. This is an umbrella term. There's lots of different story grammar based approaches. There's one called Brady, the story grammar marker. It's like an actual braid of yarn, and it has these pieces on it. But basically it's, story grammar is this idea that stories have the same grammar, which is that they have a character, they have a setting, they have a series of events, that the main character tries to get what they want. The main character has a wish. There's something blocking it from getting the wish, and it's kind of how most stories go. And so it teaches kids to identify those particular parts in an incremental and measurable way. The next is Project Read. Project Read is also a story grammar approach, but also they have a really great nonfiction approach that has these kind of it's like a highlighting system where it tells you if you're reading about animals, these are the 9 categories that all books about animals will tell you about: habitat, what they eat, that kind of stuff. So it teaches kids to underline and code that particular information and then sort it into these specific graphic organizers. One of the nice things about Project Read, and why I recommend it at a lot of IEP meetings, is that Project Read is very inexpensive, with the kind of each manual being $200 or $300. And that sounds a lot for an individual to buy, but for a school district, that is a bargain. And so I recommend Project Read a lot, particularly for schools that don't have a comprehension program. They have a decoding program, but the comprehension, they're just quote unquote working on the goals, which means that the teachers are usually pulling stuff from Teachers Pay Teachers. So we want to have something that has a real scope and sequence to it so that we can see progress over time. And then last is Fountas and Pinnell, which is actually, it's not last, there's one more, which is the actual assessment we use, but they have a whole intervention system of these leveled books and such, which is a good kind of incremental program as well. And then last, and this is free, is Florida Center for Reading Research. They have many, many, many tools on their website, including strategies for comprehension. So this is a kind of not last resort, but it's definitely something that I recommend a lot when I know that schools have really scarce resources. The last aspect of reading that I want to talk about is vocabulary. Vocabulary is something that we need to develop over time, and the old way of kind of giving kids a list of vocabulary words to memorize, we found out through research, is not effective. It really is not going to give kids a firm basis in what those words actually mean. It's going to give them a textbook definition, but they're not going to know necessarily how to apply it or what to do when they see that word in context. So the first strategy is to pre-teach. If you're going to be teaching a book, or the teacher is going to be teaching a book, look through that book and see which words are new words, right? And then start to introduce them in casual conversation intentionally 2 or 3 weeks before that book, right? So you want to give a lot of exposure to that new vocabulary before they even get a chance to see it in the book. So you can pre-teach those words and then use them a lot over and over and over again. Use it naturalistically and use it in your instruction. So you and the teacher and the speech therapist may all want to be on the same page, that you're all teaching those same words. You also want to provide examples of those words and also non-examples, right? So we want to know what the synonyms for the words are, but if we want to know what gigantic is, we're going to show you all the things that are gigantic, but we also want to show you some things that aren't gigantic. So that there's no confusion about, maybe there's something that is, there's no miscommunication. So we could look at 5 different buildings that are all gigantic, and your child could walk away with, they're all gigantic because they're all buildings, right? So we want to provide some things that are small so we understand that it's actually about the size. Another great strategy is joint action routines. And these are really popular, I feel like 10 years ago, and they kind of went away. And I really liked them, which were creating routines with groups of people. So either groups of students, people in a family, where everyone is responsible for a different part of the routine. And each part of the routine has specific language that goes with it. So let's say we're going to make cookies, right? So the first person would be responsible for stirring, and they would say, I am stirring the cookies. And then they would pass it to the next person. I am scooping the cookies. I am baking the cookies, right? So it's kind of breaking up a routine into a lot of different parts and then doing it all together. But it's a great way to introduce new vocabulary in context. And then also generalize. So this is one of the kind of critiques of kind of discrete trial teaching, which is a component of ABA, which is that we're teaching things, sitting across from someone at a table where we're pointing to this is red, this card is red, point to red, blah, 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 right? Then when we see red in real life, we have no idea what it means because we've only learned red to mean this specific card. So generalization is actually learning that word, in every different scenario. So we saw a red car, we saw a red button, we saw this, there's red in the book, there's red on my shirt, it's using it over and over and over again so that you are able to create meaning for that word outside of these very narrow teaching spaces. Some vocabulary reminders is to simplify direction. So oftentimes we want to simplify language for our kids. We want to make sure they understand. If you're telling someone that something is not safe, it's okay to say not safe, right? That's very clear. That's not safe, or don't touch, right? But when you're in a casual conversation where it's not a direction, it's not life and death, you don't need to simplify your language as much as you think. If you always are simplifying your language, then your child gets no exposure to more complex language. And how are we going to develop more complex language if we never, ever hear it? It's one of those things you hear therapists and teachers talking in this sing-song baby voice to autistic children. Then we wonder why autistic children develop a sing-song baby voice, because no one ever talks to autistic children with the full breadth of what most people are exposed to in the years that they're developing language. So it's okay to simplify for things that need to be understood. Don't touch, don't cross. But in your everyday, when you're driving in the car, even if your child, you think maybe they don't understand, presume competence and keep modeling that more complex language, because we're never going to develop more complex language if we don't hear it over and over and over again, which is how all children develop language. They hear it environmentally. If your child uses a word incorrectly, or they say the wrong word, or they say it incorrectly, instead of saying, oh, no, it's blah, 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 right? So if someone hands you something and that they're trying to tell you that the color is pink, and they hand it to you and they say it's fink or something, you say, oh, thank you, a pink car, right? So you model it back to them the correct way without making it sound that you're giving a correction. That way it becomes a really natural back and forth, and it doesn't sound like you're constantly correcting your children. And then as far as your IEP goes, I know not everyone who's listening is in the US, but whatever your legal document that governs your special education is, if something isn't working, change it. So there's many, many ways to teach children to read. Schools will often push the one that they have available. So they'll say, oh, if Wilson isn't working, then, well, let's do 15 more years of Wilson or whatever. But just because your child has something in school doesn't mean that that there aren't other things that are better. And your school district can learn about those things and teach them to your child. And so if something isn't working, there are many, many other ways to teach the same thing. And to that point, the data should really be your guide. So you should be seeing, a typically developing child, you should see a bump in their reading level every 6 weeks. A child who has, more significant intellectual disabilities or, layers of disability, it may not be that fast, but there should not go years and years and years that you do not see an increase in a reading level. So if something's not working, we need to reevaluate what we're doing and doing the same thing over and over and over again. If it hasn't worked in 1 year, it's not going to work in 2. And then the last one is that your progress monitoring should be done with fidelity. So what does that mean? It means that we should be doing running records or reading assessment regularly. So even if we're not moving up a level every 6 weeks, 6 weeks is the longest I would push it, where we're not doing some sort of reading assessment, looking at what our child is doing in school. And there should be data. If there's not an improvement in 6 weeks, and then again in 12 weeks, and then again in 18 weeks, we really need to figure out what's going wrong and shake that up a little bit. And so we're not going to know that it's not working if we're not taking data regularly about reading. So I tend to stick to that 6-week rule. And that comes from Founders Manel and the DRA recommend progress monitoring every 6 weeks, at least. So I'm going to end this here and close my thing here. And I'm going to look at the questions. I have so many questions right here. And I will answer some of those questions. For a child who gets excited to share ideas, but his words get drawn out where he's formulating the phrasing, is that a fluency issue or a processing speed issue? Do you mean... So 2 things. If the actual word is being extended, they may be extending it to buy themselves some time to process. Or they may be, it may be a kind of fluency issue where they're one step ahead. They're having trouble matching. Their brain is going faster than their mouth is able to go. So sometimes it's that kind of like, you're prompting them by being curious, where you're saying, I really want to understand what you're saying. Can you go back to the part where blah, blah, blah happened. Or I don't know who the character is. We know a lot of our kids also like to start stories in the middle of the story. So I can't tell you how many times I've been teaching where a child has started a story. Uncle John said, I'm like, wait, let's go back. Who's Uncle John? I don't know him. So tell me about him. Where were you with him? Bringing them back to like the beginning of the story, which is that you need to tell people who are the characters and who are the setting, even when you're talking about your regular life. So it's important. You can kind of do that with like questions. Oh, I really want to understand, but I don't know who that person is. Can you tell me who that person is? Let's go back. And kind of getting them to slow down and make sure that they're giving you all of the necessary information for you to understand. Okay. So Beth says, do you think hyperlexic kids learn more from reading than from verbal? And if so, will they always learn better written? I don't think always. I think we have to be careful with our hyperlexic kids because a lot of hyperlexic kids will read as a stim, right? So they like the sounds of words and are reading, and we're so happy because we're like, oh, they're reading, we love it, so great. But they're not really taking away meaning. And so I can't, I've had many a conversation with parents where they're shocked at their child's reading levels lower than they anticipated because they are such, readers at home, when really they are not taking away meaning. They are hearing letters and sounds, right? And they like it, and they like decoding words, but they're not necessarily taking that meaning away. And so I think we have to balance letting our kids have those stims that they enjoy, and also as readers, making sure that they can stop and tell me what they just read, or stop and make some meaning out of what they just read. Because otherwise you get to a point where it looks like, they're reading so much and we're so happy, but we are not actually doing the work of reading, right? Which is making meaning out of text. We are just actually, decoding instead of doing all of that vocabulary fluency comprehension piece of it. Okay, book suggestions. Oh, that's all me. Okay, Lisa Lucas, do you have an example of how some of these programs teach children to comprehend a character's intention or anything that's not explicitly stated in the reading? That's a really hard one because oftentimes this is something that even people who are professional reading people have a hard time understanding, is that social skills and reading comprehension of fiction go hand in hand. So if we can't understand people's intentions in real life, it's really hard to do it in text. And so it's going to be helping kids to go through, usually there's clues, those context clues, but we're going to maybe go through and we're going to underline everything we think is a clue, right? And then we're going to put it all down on a paper and say, it's kind of making that implicit explicit. So to like go through and say, oh, I think that maybe they want blank. Let's go through and find all of the times that maybe we could tell what they want. And teaching them to look at the pictures and look at what they're saying, and then maybe, kind of collating all of that information to the point that now we have a list and we can say, oh yeah, I think they really do want that. Which is something that, helps socially too, is to say, what is the evidence I have that somebody wants something? So it's important to kind of help them along that process. And oftentimes that's a skill that's really hard for kids to begin with, for autistic kids, understanding what other people want. I struggled with that as an adult. I don't know. You got to tell me. But when we're reading, we're being asked to do that same thing is to inference. So it's going to be a matter of kind of thinking through what the evidence is. So there are ways to do that. And a lot of it is just kind of slowing down to kind of put together what the clues are. Jessica says, yes, both of those occur. Thank you. And he hates interrupting with questions, needs to finish his original thought before he gets peppered with questions. Yes. So he probably wants to like get out. He's so excited about what he's reading. So it's really great. You can kind of sandwich that, those questions with, wow, this is so interesting. Wow. I'm really wondering about blank, right? And so you can kind of offer those questions in a way that seems really natural, right? And doesn't sound like you're being school, like our kids don't want to hear us be the teacher necessarily, right? But you can say, wow, I'm so interested in the story. Can you help me understand? And then, here we go. How would you suggest prompting not to guess on words with a beginning reader? Good idea. So a lot of times our kids, especially that one, don't like reading, or two, are not confident in their decoding skills, will see the beginning two words and they will just guess any word. So they'll see W and they're like Winnebago, like just anything. So you're going to want to say, oh, let's go back. I think I know this is a word, or this is a word. Look, you have digraph, you have a vowel, and you have another digraph. You know how to break this apart. Let's do it. Right? Or you can help slow them down to tap it out with you, right? You can also, if you have a kid that skips ahead, cover the rest of the sentence. Then they can't go ahead. The other thing too is to make sure that your home library, so you're going to want to have kind of like almost two home libraries, a library of, and it doesn't have to be fancy. It could be one shelf versus another. It could be a basket by your bed versus, like at my house, we have like a couple of books downstairs that are in like a, like our TV cabinet, and then she has a bookcase in her room. The ones upstairs are ones we read together, and the ones downstairs I know are, quote unquote, good fit books. If your child can't read, it's like the 5-finger rule. If your child can't read more than 5 words on the first page, it is not a good fit book. So part of that is to make sure that the books that they have to read independently are books that that they can decode. And books they don't always label them correctly. Like I will look at a book that's it's labeled a level C or something, which really shouldn't have anything more than consonant, vowel, consonant, and maybe a silent E. And we'll have words that are like way more complex. I'm like, so kind of knowing what those books are for them to read alone. And then when you're reading together, like you read most of them and stop on the word that they can decode. Part of that is learning, which phonics patterns follow which ones. But your easiest ones are going to be your consonant, vowel, consonant. And after that, right, they learn silent E. Then they learn to combine silent E plus a consonant, vowel, consonant in one word. So make sure that you are kind of stopping on the ones that that they can do. And if they really are like skip, cover the rest of the sentence. And kind of slow them down a little bit, because you want to make sure that they're getting that practice, especially if you're practicing at home. And guessing, they used to be the way that, they would tell kids to guess. They would say, oh, take a guess. We want to only make sure that, we are pushing kids to be responsible only for the phonics patterns they know. So proper nouns usually don't follow are not phonetically regular. Your sight words, you can't sound those out. So sight words, they have to memorize. So like I wouldn't, let me think of like a sight word. Like what, right? So we often tell kids to sound out what, and what is not phonetically regular. It should be wet, because it's consonant, vowel, consonant. It should be a short vowel. So we only want to push kids to sound out words that we know that they know the phonics for. I hope that makes sense. And slow them down for just those words, and then you kind of read through with the rest of them. Make sure I didn't miss any other comments. Beth says you're so awesome. Thank you, Beth. You're so awesome. Thank you. Nisa says, I love the suggestion to model, not correct. I need to make this change. It's really easy to just slip it back into what you repeat back to them, and it gets the job done without putting them on the spot. So it works too with like articulation. So if they say, my daughter used to call a baby a Didi, right? So she would be like, oh, a Didi BF. She used to say baby giraffe, DDBF. And I'd be like, yes, a baby giraffe. I love baby giraffes, right? So you're just going to say it back to them. They hear it. And then maybe you can ask them, you'd be like, oh, who do you want to see next after we see and then like give them a chance to say it back after you've just modeled it. As opposed to correct, because, we know our kids get so much of that. So we want to just make sure that it's, that we're supporting them in hearing it the correct way, but without constantly asking them to correct themselves, especially when they're not able to yet. Let me make sure I didn't miss any other questions. I think I'm good. Let's see if there's anyone on TikTok. And I think we're good. He's 4 and he says, freck best. Yeah, so you're just going to repeat it back to him. Oh yeah, breakfast, my favorite, right? And like you're going to even like say exaggerated so they're seeing it. But you don't want to turn your everyday life into a speech session, but you want to make sure you're modeling it over and over and over again. They need so many exposures. And now my daughter is 7 and she doesn't say DDBF anymore. And I'm kind of sad about it, but it's really, just that modeling, the more they hear it, right? They're hearing it correctly. So eventually their articulation is going to catch up, right? So as long as you keep modeling it, right? And they're getting the support they need from their speech therapist. But at home, you don't necessarily want to be correcting all the time. Because that just makes your home life kind of, a lot for them and for you. And also can contribute to kind of like behavior issues. So it's much better to just model backwards. Thank you all for the great questions and for attending tonight. Reminder to everybody, our parenting course is, thank you, Lisa. And I hope that you all sign up for our parenting course. It's going to be awesome. I would love to have you there. And we have early bird pricing and registration available now. So I'm going to end the stream right now. And thank you all for coming. And I look forward to next week. And I hope that you all can be there. All right. Bye, everyone.